On September 9th, 1976, at 10 minutes past midnight, the most powerful man in the world's most populous country took his final breath in a heavily guarded hospital room in Beijing. For nearly 3 decades, this man had controlled the lives of almost 1 billion people, launched campaigns that killed tens of millions, and transformed an ancient civilization into a modern communist state through sheer force of will and unprecedented brutality. His name was Mao Zedong, and when he died, he left behind a legacy so complex and controversial that even today, nearly 50 years later, historians struggle to measure whether he was China's greatest hero or its most devastating tyrant. This is the story of how a farmer's son from a tiny village became the architect of modern China, a revolutionary who liberated his people from foreign domination only to subject them to campaigns of terror that would claim more lives than both world wars combined. And a peasant who rose to wield more absolute power than any emperor in China's 5,000-year history. Mao Zedong was born on December 26, 1893, in the village of Shaoshan in Hunan Province, at a time when China was collapsing under the weight of foreign invasions, internal rebellions, and a crumbling imperial government that had ruled for over 2,000 years. His father, Mao Yichong, had climbed from poverty to become what he proudly called a rich peasant, owning 3 acres of rice fields and operating a small grain trading business that made the family relatively wealthy by village standards. But young Mao's relationship with his father was filled with conflict and rebellion from his earliest years, setting a pattern of defiance against authority that would define his entire life. When his father arranged a traditional marriage for him at age 14 to a girl he had never met, Mao refused to acknowledge the wedding and never lived with his bride, shocking the conservative village community with his bold rejection of ancient customs. At age 8, Mao had been sent to the local primary school, where he learned to read and write using the Confucian classics, ancient texts that taught respect for authority, social harmony, and acceptance of one's place in society. But instead of accepting these traditional teachings, Mao found himself drawn to stories of rebellion and warfare, devouring tales of ancient Chinese warriors who had overthrown dynasties and conquered empires through cunning and ruthless determination. When he was 13, his father demanded that he quit school and work full-time on the family farm, but Mao had bigger dreams than spending his life planting rice in the mud of Hunan Province. In an act of teenage rebellion that would change the course of world history, he ran away from home to continue his education in the provincial capital of Changsha, where he encountered ideas that would transform him from a village troublemaker into a professional revolutionary. The year 1911 brought earth-shaking changes to China when the Xinhai Revolution finally overthrew the Qing dynasty and ended over 2,000 years of imperial rule, replacing the ancient monarchy with the Republic of China. 18-year-old Mao swept up in the revolutionary excitement, enlisted in the Republican Army, and spent 6 months as a soldier, where he first learned that, as he would later write, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. After his brief military service, Mao spent several years searching for his path in life, trying police school, law school, business school, and even spending months reading Western philosophy and political theory in the provincial library, absorbing the ideas of European thinkers who had written about revolution, democracy, and social change. This period of intellectual exploration prepared him for the moment in 1918 when he traveled to Beijing to work as a librarian's assistant at Peking University, China's most prestigious center of learning. It was at Peking University that Mao encountered the 2 men who would change his life forever: Li Dazhao and Chen Duxiu, the intellectual founders of Chinese Marxism, who introduced him to the revolutionary theories of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. More importantly, Mao arrived in Beijing just as the May 4th movement of 1919 was transforming Chinese politics, as students and intellectuals abandoned hope for gradual reform and embraced radical revolution as the only solution to China's problems.
The May 4th movement began as protests against the decision at the Paris Peace Conference to give former German territories in China to Japan, instead of returning them to Chinese control. But it quickly became a nationwide awakening that rejected traditional Chinese culture and embraced Western ideas of science, democracy, and revolution. For young Mao, this movement provided both inspiration and opportunity, as he returned to Hunan Province to organize students, workers, and intellectuals into revolutionary groups that would challenge the existing social order. In 1921, at age 27, Mao attended the secret founding meeting of the Chinese Communist Party in Shanghai, becoming one of the original 57 members of an organization that would eventually rule the world's largest nation. But in these early years, Mao was considered a secondary figure in the party, overshadowed by more educated urban intellectuals who believed that communist revolution would come from industrial workers in China's cities, following the pattern established by Lenin's Bolsheviks in Russia. Mao had a different vision that would prove to be his genius. He understood that in a country where over 90% of the population were peasants, any successful revolution would have to mobilize the vast rural masses who had been ignored and oppressed for centuries. During the 1920s, while other communist leaders focused on organizing factory workers, Mao traveled through the countryside of Hunan Province, studying peasant life, and building a revolutionary movement based on land reform and rural rebellion. His opportunity to test these theories came in 1927, when Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Nationalist Party, turned against his former communist allies and launched a campaign of extermination that nearly destroyed the Chinese Communist Party in a series of brutal massacres across urban China. While other communist leaders fled to the Soviet Union or went into hiding, Mao retreated to the remote mountains of Jiangxi Province, where he began building a revolutionary base area, defended by guerrilla fighters who would become the legendary Red Army. For 6 years, from 1928 to 1934, Mao ruled over a communist mini-state in the mountains of southeast China, implementing radical land reforms that gave peasant families their own plots of land for the first time in their lives, establishing people's courts that tried and executed landlords and local officials, and developing the guerrilla warfare tactics that would eventually defeat much larger and better equipped enemy armies through superior mobility, local support, and ruthless determination. But by 1934, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces had surrounded the communist base areas with a ring of fortified positions and were slowly crushing the Red Army through a strategy of gradual strangulation that threatened to destroy the communist movement entirely. Facing complete annihilation, Mao and 100,000 communist fighters began one of the most extraordinary military retreats in human history, the Long March, a 6,000-mile fighting withdrawal across some of the most dangerous terrain in China. For over a year, from October 1934 to October 1935, the Red Army battled its way across rivers, mountains, deserts, and swamplands, fighting constant battles against nationalist troops, local warlords, and hostile tribes, while struggling against hunger, disease, and exhaustion that killed thousands of marchers every month. When the survivors finally reached the safety of Yan'an in northern China, only about 20,000 of the original 100,000 marchers were still alive. But they had accomplished something that seemed impossible. They had preserved the communist movement and established Mao as the undisputed leader of Chinese communism. During the Long March, at a crucial party meeting in the town of Zunyi, Mao had outmaneuvered his rivals and seized control of the Communist Party leadership, arguing that his rural-based strategy was the only path to victory in a country like China. From his new headquarters in the cave dwellings of Yan'an, Mao spent the next decade building the communist movement into a disciplined political and military organization that would be ready to seize power when the opportunity arose.
That opportunity came after Japan's surrender in 1945 ended World War II and left China divided between the nationalist government and the communist forces, setting the stage for the final phase of the Chinese Civil War. Using the guerrilla tactics he had perfected during the Long March, Mao's People's Liberation Army gradually gained control of China's countryside, surrounding the cities and cutting off the nationalist forces from their supply bases and rural support. The Civil War reached its climax in a series of massive battles during 1948 and 1949 that saw entire nationalist armies surrender to the communists, as soldiers and officers switched sides rather than continue fighting for a corrupt and demoralized government. On October 1st, 1949, standing on the rostrum of the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing's Forbidden City, Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, declaring to a crowd of hundreds of thousands that the Chinese people have stood up. For the first time in over a century, China was unified under a strong government, free from foreign domination. And for millions of Chinese people, Mao Zedong was the hero who had accomplished this miracle of national liberation and independence. But the cost of victory had been enormous. The Civil War had killed millions of people and devastated large areas of the country, and the new communist government faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding a nation that had been torn apart by decades of warfare and foreign invasion. Mao's solution was to launch a series of radical campaigns designed to rapidly transform China from a poor agricultural country into a modern industrial power that could compete with the United States and Soviet Union. The first of these campaigns, the Great Leap Forward, began in 1958, with Mao's declaration that China would surpass Britain in steel production within 15 years, through the mobilization of popular enthusiasm and revolutionary will. The reality was catastrophic beyond imagination, as Mao's impossible demands for increased production led to false reporting, waste of resources, and the abandonment of agriculture in favor of backyard steel furnaces that produced worthless metal while crops rotted in the fields. The result was the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 1961, the deadliest famine in human history, which killed between 15 and 55 million people, as government policies prevented food from reaching starving villages, while officials continued to report record harvests to avoid Mao's wrath. Rather than learning from this disaster, Mao became convinced that enemies within the Communist Party were sabotaging his revolutionary vision, leading him to launch an even more destructive campaign in 1966, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Declaring war against old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits, Mao mobilized millions of young Red Guards to attack teachers, intellectuals, government officials, and anyone suspected of insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm in a campaign of violence and destruction that tore apart the fabric of Chinese society. For 10 years, from 1966 to 1976, China was convulsed by political campaigns that destroyed priceless cultural artifacts, closed schools and universities, sent millions of educated people to labor camps in the countryside, and created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia, where neighbors denounced neighbors and children informed on their parents. The death toll from the Cultural Revolution has been estimated at between 1 and 2 million people, while millions more had their lives destroyed by persecution, imprisonment, and exile. By the early 1970s,
Even Mao seemed to recognize that his revolutionary campaigns had gone too far, and he began to moderate his policies while seeking better relations with the outside world. The most dramatic symbol of this change came in February 1972, when President Richard Nixon visited Beijing for a historic meeting with Mao that ended more than 2 decades of hostility between China and the United States, and began the process that would eventually integrate China into the global economy. But Mao's health was declining rapidly as he suffered from Parkinson's disease and a series of heart attacks that left him increasingly frail and unable to control the day-to-day operations of government. As different factions within the Communist Party maneuvered for position in the succession struggle, China entered a period of political uncertainty that would only be resolved after Mao's death.
When Mao Zedong died on September 9, 1976, at age 82, he left behind a legacy that defies simple judgment. He had unified China, ended foreign domination, and transformed his country into a major world power. But he had also been responsible for political campaigns that killed more people than any other leader in human history. Within months of his death, his widow and her allies in the Gang of Four were arrested, and new leaders began the economic reforms that would eventually make China the world's second largest economy. Today, nearly 50 years after his death, Mao Zedong remains one of history's most controversial figures, revered by some as the founder of modern China, and reviled by others as a tyrant whose policies caused immense human suffering. His portrait still hangs over the entrance to the Forbidden City in Beijing, and his body lies in a crystal sarcophagus in Tiananmen Square, visited by millions of Chinese tourists who come to pay their respects to the peasant boy who became the most powerful man in Chinese history.